This is The Meaningful Way. I'm your host, Luke Iorio. You know, life can certainly get so much more meaningful when we are able to unlock happiness, let alone unlocking happiness at work and well beyond. In addition to that, what if we had the ability to unlock that happiness for future generations and that it comes down to being a hero? Well, we're going to talk about all of that on today's episode as I welcome Jennifer Moss, the co-founder of Plasticity Labs, to our show. She's the co-founder of Plasticity Labs, the author of Unlocking Happiness at Work, and she is considered to be a happiness expert and thought leader on the topic of emotional intelligence and in organizational performance. Jennifer is most recently recognized with the International Female Entrepreneur of the Year Award and named a Canadian Innovator of the Year. Jennifer spent a decade working in Silicon Valley during the formative years of social and digital technology, and during her time in San Jose, she was honored with the Public Service Award from the Office of President Obama and also attended his inauguration. She's also the co-founder of the Hero Generation, something we're going to be talking about quite a bit today, a nonprofit that works with schools to improve student and teacher mental health. The research of those outcomes are actually going to be presented at the World Happiness Summit in the middle of March, which I know we've been chatting about as well. And so with that, Jennifer, thanks so much for coming on The Meaningful Way.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. This is a great podcast, and I'm happy to be part of it.
Thanks. So in preparing for the show, I saw one of your favorite quotes. And one of those quotes happens to be from a man that I personally think is one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Of course, I'm referencing Dr. Seuss. And so you talked about, the quote that you pulled out was, "You're in pretty good shape for the shape you are in." What is it that you love about that quote?
What I love about it, well, because Dr. Seuss is so prophetic and intelligent, and he does it in a way that's so tangible for people. I mean, we always joke about our software. If a 2-year-old can use it, then it's going to work for the world, yep. Right? So that's what I think the elegance of Dr. Seuss and his quotes, they're just so impactful. But he's basically saying that, you know, the state that we're in today, it's pretty good. And we need to be in the moment and be present in the moment, because right now, this is how we are, and It's okay. And there's always going to be someone that's going to have it tougher than us and someone that's going to have it easier than us. But we're always going to be in that state in the middle constantly. So, you know, understanding that there has to be presence, but also just that, you know, just that we have to appreciate and be grateful for being here and being okay. And what is our baseline? You know, someone's baseline could be different than another person's. It's all relative. But if we can get back to our baseline of what, you know, that we're here, we're breathing, we have fairly decent health, and you know, we're walking, we're running, we have most of our faculties, and we're in a pretty, you know, generally good disposition. Well, then that's enough. You know, that has
Absolutely.
to be enough.
You know, it's interesting because as you even bring that up and bringing forward the concepts, obviously, of being present with where we are, being grateful for where we are, but there's also almost this underlying condition of acceptance that we yep. embody, right? So there's just this acceptance of, this is where we are today. This is what's brought us here. That's okay. And everything that's happened up until now, that's fine. It is what it is. What do I get to do now? And now we have choice. So
that is a perfect. That's a perfect assessment of it, because that's exactly it. It's always about choice. We're in the shape that we're in. So here we go. What are we going to do next?
So along those lines, I've got to ask a little bit about life before Plasticity Labs, because you've got this amazing, what many would call a sweet gig, which is that you get to bring the power of happiness into schools and organizations that want it so much. However, I'm guessing that's not quite where things began. And so I'm curious a little bit about your journey of, you know, what was life before you really turned into and focused on this work? What did life look like? What did work look like?
I do say I'm an accidental entrepreneur, so which is the best way, I think.
Best way to do it.
I actually had foresight into what it was like to manage a startup. You would probably run away screaming, because it's pretty tough. It's very challenging, especially when you're trying to bring a new idea like happiness at work and happiness, you know, in schools, and there's such a sort of a saccharine thinking around our interpretation of what happiness is, that you have to convince a lot of people of what happiness isn't and what it is. And so I have fallen into this. The start of this really was about 7 years ago now, and we were living in California. My husband got very sick, and that was was a scary moment. He was a pro lacrosse player, and he was told he wasn't going to walk again, and that changed us. We had a reset moment. When we talk about reset, that's it. And what he used in that hospital room was gratitude. We read all the books. We looked at the science. We went back to the research, the things that make us always feel better as the data and science. That's the kind of folks that Jim and I are. And so we went back and looked at it, and everyone said that, the power of healing is really comes from within, and that you can think positively. And there's a lot of other things that happen in that moment. You need to have really good healthcare and lots of support and all those other things that matter. But sort of that squishy place is the gratitude. And so we started to practice that, and it led to Jim walking out of the hospital after 6 weeks.
Wow.
And so that moment for us, like I said, was life-changing. It brought us back to Canada because we were missing our family and realizing that we were too far away and that our roots were here. Moved back to Canada and started trying to sort of unpack what gratitude really meant from the science standpoint. And we're testing it with our kids and in schools. And that's where the Smiles in Schools started, just a project out of Jim going back to university and doing some research. And what we noticed was gratitude actually does really impact everyone. It leads to high performance, or the traits of high performers. And so, skip ahead to now, and it evolved. It just evolved from this project that grew into a bigger project, and then we had a company said, let's white label that and see how we can actually impact our employees. And so we researched that, and then it just grew. And I think that's like an idea that can't stop. You can't shake an idea like that. And that's what's continued to push us forward and motivate us to keep doing it, because we see it working, we see it changing people's lives, we see it impacting kids, and so now it's grown a bit bigger than we ever thought it would.
Sure.
And now I get to do this gig full time, which is great.
So there's a few things I'd like to just dive a little further into, because when anybody goes down kind of a new path, and especially under the extreme type of conditions of the health condition that your husband was in, there's that period of time where you're going on faith. And so no matter what the research is that's out there, I mean, that's part of the background that you guys did, but you're going on faith of, I'm going to try this, I'm going to lean into it, but you're not really sure how it's going to come about. And I'm just curious, at what point did that faith start to turn into just this realization of, wow, these pieces are really coming together. This is working from a health standpoint. And then obviously the ensuing projects, you kept hitting that tipping point, and it just more and more just kept coming together. So I'm just curious, what was that? Where at what point did that rubber meet the road and you said, wow, it's coming together?
It started from day one. It really did. I mean, we were told that Jim might not live. And then, we were blessed with this amazing, recovery in such a short amount of time. And it was like, you intuitively get that there's something that's different about this. And there's a lot of rationale that you can go to, like Jim's physical health and the fact that he had high psychological fitness and physical fitness, and he was a healthy 30-year-old. So yeah, it made sense that he recovered quickly. But we also noticed that people, the more grateful he was, the more people gravitated towards him, and the more help he got, and the more services were provided to him. And we started to look into that research, the social contagion piece, and how happiness is actually catching and gratitude is catching, just similar to how divorce and depression are catching. Social contagions are real. And what we realized was that every time we went back to those tools, that we would get this, this gratification from it. The fact that we were grateful and we had support, it gives you that reinforcement that what you're doing is right. And then bringing it into schools and studying it and seeing, wow, kids that do 21 days of gratitude actually show 10% improvement on engagement after just 2-3 weeks. And wow, they actually have a reduction in bullying and a better sense of community and sense of self within 3 weeks. So once you get that intuition and then you measure it and you actually look at the results of doing the work and having these interventions, it starts to not just validate, but then that validation becomes very real. That faith becomes, reality. And that's where I actually think those two, these two marry more than we realize. That faith and science are actually quite intertangled, and you have to have both to really feel like something is real, because you have to have intuition and science blended, I think.
Well, I love the connection there to the idea of that social contagion, because of the way the energy, the attitude, the perception, everything that you're putting out there, and the way that truly does catch on, because it's just the way in which we impact and influence others. And so that certainly is one of those areas where the faith has spread in such a regard that it is going to come back to you based on what you're putting out there. Also reminds all of us to be very mindful of what it is that we're putting out there. The other thing that you just brought up was that connection of happiness and engagement. And you've also mentioned happiness, engagement, and performance. And I was wondering if you could break those down a little bit for us, of make some distinctions of, what's happiness, what's engagement, how does this all affect ultimately the performance of what shows up for us?
That's a great question, because it really does get sort of mixed into the same pool. And we've been able to sort of detangle that. And we've looked at a lot of the academic research around that. And Martin Seligman, you're probably familiar, former head of the psychology, American Psychology Association, and then started to form this model of happiness, which is PERMA, positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And so he's created this sort of 5-pillar model that I think he's expanded on now, but that was really that nugget started from. And what we found is that people that had, this sort of those 5 pillars in sort of high amounts were a happier person. But we started to look at that, okay, well, so that's right in life in general. But then how do we actually look at that in the workplace specifically, where we're looking at outcomes like engagement? And what we realized is that there's these other components, we call them hero traits, and they're hope, efficacy, resilience, optimism, otherwise referred to as psychological capital. And so we also look at that, plus mindfulness, gratitude, empathy, sort of this larger picture of these traits. And that's what actually leads you to, combine with this PERMA model, leads you to be a happier person, which is an outcome. So for us, we're really looking at where is it way, way, way further upstream in the whole sort of engagement journey. And what you need to have are these sort of high, focus or psychological fitness in these traits. And then the downstream impact is engagement, is not even just that you become happier, but more that you're more able to be in tune to happiness when it's in front of you. So just like any emotion, it's fleeting, right? But you have these sort of high capacity for resilience or high capacity for optimism or empathy. And then the downstream impact is that you're happier. And then even further downstream from that is you become more engaged just in general in life and work and what you're, focusing on. So it's kind of taking the PERMA model and understanding that it might be a little bit further on, because you can't necessarily have those high performing relationships unless you yourself are authentically happy, which means you also have to be high in those hero traits.
Excellent. So I want to come back to those hero traits, because I want to dive in a little bit further, because what you're describing are effectively qualities that cause everything else that we've talked about then. So if we're at this deeper core level, these are the things that ultimately will trigger and bring about the things that we're chasing, as it were. And so if we go back to let's start with the workplace happiness, because obviously this is the book that you just wrote, the first book that you've put out there on this work. And I'm curious if you could dive a little further into not just what workplace happiness is, meaning what does that look like in the workplace terms, but why now? Meaning, why is this something that organizations really, really, really need to be paying attention to right now?
Well, and then there's a lot of reasons around that. And first, workplace, we spend 90,000 hours of our lifetime roughly at work. That's a big number. And, there's this old way of thinking that, clock in, clock out, and then the rest of your life begins outside of those hours. But that just feels like a massive chunk of your life that you are not engaged and happy and feeling good and enjoying and having your life and having quality of life. So, Matthew Ricard talked about that 10% happier. I mean, we need to look at work as having employers and employees think, how can I at least make my time at work, those 90,000 hours, 10% better if I'm unhappy? And the thing is that the majority of employees aren't very happy. 30% of the global workforce is actually actively disengaged, which they are in a state of anxiety or depression, or they're actively trying to make the workplace an unhappy place. But the majority of employees are just sort of in there and clocking in and clocking out. There's only a very small percentage, around 20%, that are engaged. So if you look at that, only 20% of people are spending their 90,000 hours of their lifetime in a state of enjoyment in what they do. And that's a massive miss, in my opinion. I also think that, when we look at the workplaces that are the highest performing, it always goes back to, in all the research that was done, Google did this great Project Aristotle, where they looked at the highest performing teams, and they spent 4.5 years analyzing. And what they found was psychological safety was the key to high performing teams. So that's basically like being nice is the key to success in these business these high performing organizations. So not only is it good for business, you should do that. There's a win-win, but I also think as leaders who care about their employees and care about being successful and competitive, happiness is important. It's also millennials that are driving it. There's a lot of sort of anger towards millennials because they want purpose, and I kind of joke like, oh God, these terrible millennials that want purpose, they're just horrible people. It's awful that they want to have and enjoy their 90,000 hours of their life. They're really driving the change, and that's not a bad thing. I think we need to look at, we've had this way of thinking, and yes, it means that we have to change, the dialogue, change the work environment, and it might not be easy, and change is tough, but that this drive for having purpose is actually going to benefit the bottom line. It's going to be better for everyone. Plus, it's just good because people will live longer, they'll have better relationships, it'll be a more enjoyable experience at work for most of our lives, and we can't ignore that. We can't ignore that any longer.
So let's use that actually as kind of another jumping off point, because if we're helping people in that pursuit of the purpose is something that's really powerful and a driver, and it's going to benefit a lot, how is it that we create that alignment with leadership, an organization, and the employees of that organization? Because if we can figure that out, my guess is the same holds pretty true for family structure as well.
It's about looking at the whole being, and there's lots of discussion now around the whole being, and understand that we don't bifurcate between work and life. The stress that happens at life in life comes into work, and the stress that comes into work comes into our lives. So it's about understanding that there's a whole bunch of things that are going to be integrated now into work. It's no longer work-life balance; it's work-life integration. Another thing is, that there's a impact of technology and all of those other things that are changing that way of going into the workforce. But I do think, or going into the workplace, but I think that what we need to really understand and have employers understand, and leaders too, is that is what happiness isn't at work, and sort of debunking the myths around happiness. And one of the things that I always share in my talks is this picture of these stock photos of people kind of cheering and hugging each other around an Excel spreadsheet, and that's not what work is really like. And so we've created this sort of mindset that if you have happiness at work, it's creepy, or it's not real, or it's not authentic, and we're trying to just get people to come in, service with a smile, and actually force them to be happy when they're actually miserable. And that's not really what it isn't. That's not what it is. That's what it isn't. And going in, to think about creating a happiness strategy, if you are a leader or employer, it's about looking at, okay, how do I create resiliency so we can manage through stressful times? How do I actually create hopefulness? Because we are going to have, leaders leave that are beloved, and that's going to cause friction, or we're going to have a year where where our stocks fall? How do we give people optimism and hope that we'll get through it? How do we create conflict resolution versus conflict avoidance? Because you don't want groupthink, you want innovative thinking, you want people to push status quo. So that is what authentic happiness is. It's the safety to fail forward. It's the safety to take risk. It's the ability to have hard conversations but move on. It's about not creating gossip but having really open dialogue and clearing. There's a lot of ways that we have to look at happiness that are different, and it's not the avoidance of pessimism or the avoidance of conflict. It's about actually being strong enough and resilient enough and open enough to be able to move forward as a group and respect each other through that.
Well, the way that you're describing it is that in that regard, happiness becomes much more of a state and a culture, a way of being, a way of working, as it were, that we are ultimately trying to accomplish. It's not just about the warm and fuzzies that we get after something has gone well.
That's exactly it. I mean, you celebrate the wins, but I mean, you also have to be able to be successful, because successful actually does make everyone happy. There's a lot of benefits in you being a high performing organization that's successful and competitive. Everyone wins. There's, compensation and having all that structure in there is still really healthy. You want corporate hygiene. You don't want it to just be that you're cheering and hugging it out all the time. That's just not realistic. And there's a lot of people that don't really, enjoy that kind of environment. It's not just for the extroverts either. It's for everyone. And that means that you have to be able to, expect a level of authenticity and openness to authenticity, everyone being able to be who they want to be. But it's just more about a holistic way of thinking about mutually respectful, collaborative, and yet resilient organization. Because if we mimic how life is hard too. Life can be full of stresses, and we find a way in our family to go through those things together. So why not imagine that if you're spending as many hours with your work group, not that they have to be family, but they are part of your life, pretty significant part of your life, how do you work through those same sort of barriers and stresses and challenges with them in a way that's healthy and will create a happier environment?
So, and I, one of the things that is such a great highlight, and then I want to get into some of the hero qualities themselves, because you've been weaving them in throughout this, but that key differentiation between authentic happiness versus the Pollyanna surface that people mistake it to be. And I think that's where you're really diving into this different level of the way that it works, the way that it actually is. It is not just some whitewashing of look at how happy and smiley everybody is. So let's dive in a little bit further on these qualities of hero. And again, it was hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism. And how, maybe if I start here, I'm not sure if we need to go into the definitions of them unless there's specific distinctions you want to make there. But I am curious of how do we start working on these qualities for ourselves to create that state of being?
Well, that's a great question, because it's one I get posed a lot. How do I become happier, really? And here are these hero traits. Okay, well, now what? And how do I become more hopeful? How do I become more optimistic? Or a lot of people just say, I was kind of born and unhappy, or this isn't my way of being, and I'm kind of like being this way. And I think that's fair. There's, there is the genetic predisposition to be one way or another, but most people sort of sit in the middle of that. But we do have a high capacity for training these traits. It's actually even more malleable than some of the big 5 traits, like agreeableness, so some of those things that are quite highly genetically ingrained right from birth. But we have about sort of like a 40% wiggle room, I say, in our brain for us to be able to build up these traits. But one of the ways that I try to get people to understand how you can actually make these adjustments and how you can hardwire your brain to be more happy is that you have to create, as what Sean Aker is referred to, and he's a researcher as well, and he wrote this book, Happiness Advantage, and he talks about the happiness hygiene, and I also talk about that in the book too. But you literally have to look at creating the habit of happiness, and that means you have to practice hope and building cognitive hope daily. You have to actually spend 30 seconds or a minute writing down what you're grateful for, 3 things that you're grateful for before you go to bed at night. I mean, these are simple very simple, elegant tactics that people think, oh, well, that's too simple. Why would I spend? That's not actually going to change things. But it's about the habit of it. It's about the hardwiring and the fluency that we develop. Gratitude, for example, it sort of hardwires the same way that your brain would hardwire when you were learning French, for example. The way that when you repeat it and the way that you immerse yourself in it and you focus back on it every day, that's when you start to see the same pathways occur. And you actually develop fluency in gratitude. And you can test it. You can actually test fluency in gratitude by asking someone to write down what they're grateful for. And as they get more fluent in gratitude, the faster and easier they can recall those grateful items in their life. So it is something that we can build, but it isn't like, you just become happy in a day, or I'm going to have instant gratification and I'm going to all of a sudden, not have to deal with stress or challenges, or I'm never going to feel sad, or I'm never going to feel disappointed. And that's what the reality is that you're going to have these tools and they become part of your toolbox, but you're still going to face challenges. And when you're going through that, what you really want to be able to do is use those tools to rebound faster, to get to a state of healthiness faster. And once you start to develop that skill, what you realize is I'm not practicing gratitude anymore. I am grateful. And I'm not practicing cognitive empathy, anymore. I am actually empathetic. I'm an empath. And that happens over time, but similar to how you would practice to run a marathon, you wouldn't just go tomorrow. I mean, for me, I would probably keel over after the first mile, and I would have to take probably a solid year to get there. And that's the same thing with psychological fitness, is that you have to imagine that this is a lifestyle change, not a diet, and this is who you're becoming, and you have to work at it every single day.
Well, and I think even as we began a little bit with Dr. Seuss, if you're in pretty good shape for the shape you are in, part of reminding yourself of, listen, you're 20, 30, 40 years worth of programming into who you are today. And so if you're going to make that change, if you're going to go run a marathon and you've never run 100 feet, it's going to take a little time to build that up. And what I also think is cool, because I know it's part of what's underneath what you're describing here, and I just want to lay this out for everybody, is that when you begin to condition yourself this way, your mind's eye will go find this stuff for you. It'll start to pull it out of your environment. And then, of course, once it is, if it's pulling out an area that you can be more resilient, it doesn't just zap you and make you more resilient, but it shows you the opportunity where you can practice what you've been working on and bring it into the moment.
I love that you said that, Luke, because I have this really, quick, funny little story around that. We use our children as psychological experiments. So they're going to be against happiness one day, I said, because they're so tired of us talking about it so much. But we started this experiment with these with our kids, and we started to ask them every day at dinner, what made you smile today? Yeah. And so, at first we asked them things like, how was school? And they're like, oh, fine. What'd you learn? Nothing, right? And but this time we said, well, what made you smile? And Wyatt would just kind of our son would look around the table and say what was in his purview. But as we started to do this over a couple of weeks, he started to pull things, like you said, from the start of the day all the way through, because he had to report it. So he was starting to change how he was looking at the world, knowing that he had to write or share these things, around gratitude at the end of the day. And that's what our brains do. It starts to say, okay, I'm going to write down 3 things before I go to bed at night. I better notice more of the things around me so I can report to that. And then it stops noticing as much negative. It also stops, picking up all or just being neutral. It actually focuses on the things that you are grateful for. And it's amazing now how fluent these kids are in gratitude, because they're doing it all the time, all day long. And so I love that you said that, because that's absolutely true.
That's fantastic. And if we expand on the laboratory that are our children, and we go towards what you're doing with the hero generation, I'd love to just have you share a little bit more with our listeners about some of the groundbreaking work. What is the hero generation, and what is the project, the work that's being done?
Well, the Hero Generation is actually it's a passion project for me. It's something that I think I could have dedicated our lives to as a nonprofit way back when we thought that's what we were going to do. We started just going into, our kids' kindergarten classes and practicing writing down, getting the kids to actually draw because they couldn't write at this point or spell. So they just would draw what they were grateful for. And then it sort of took off, and all these kids were doing it in their own classrooms, and then teachers were picking it up into their curriculum and starting to say, okay, well, how can I teach, math and percentages or stats using gratitude? And so the kids would start to put on a chart, I'm grateful for my dog, or I'm grateful for my cat or my sister, whatever that was. And then you'd say, oh, well, 40% of the class said that their, sister was what made them grateful. So we saw this sort of assimilation of it into the curriculum. And then we thought, as we did the research, we saw that there were real improvements. And since then, we've gone into, in a full way with schools and school boards, and have created this really neat way of looking at hero schools. And we call them hero schools because we actually also, at the same time as we're coaching this into students, we're doing the same training for the teachers. So they're mirroring the learning between each other. So it's not do as I say, not as I do, because we know that educators are so purpose-driven, and yet they have a real struggle with their own self-care because they don't take the time, or they get depleted. They really care and have high levels of empathy for their students, but they don't necessarily take care of themselves. So what we do is we say, you need to put the proverbial mask on yourselves and go through this this training, and it's delivered so that it's it's grown-up training. They're not, going through the same, training as maybe a junior kindergarten child or student would, but they're going through their own sort of health, well-being training themselves. And so when they're coaching in the kids, you see this reflection, and they're transparent in that they understand that there is a struggle to build resiliency, or it is tough to be empathetic sometimes. And so they're creating even more empathy and more bonding with their students. And then we see that spread out because we have everyone that's involved in the education system using the technology, from, bus drivers to all staff to people that are, like crossing guards. We really try to make it so that it's all encompassed. And then we go out to the parents, and we have parents involved in that too. And then we measure, how is this changing a community? If we look at network effect and social contagion, what if we start with teachers and students and network effect that across our parents and our communities? We're looking at longitudinal studies to find out, does this actually reduce crime? Does this improve, job opportunities? What are graduation rates looking like? Are we improving graduation rates? Are we improving math scores? Looking at not just the academic outcomes, which are important, but also just how is this changing a community? And then the goal is to kind of piece all those communities together so we can change a province, to change a country, to change, we do have $1 billion billion person mission. Mm-hmm. And the goal is to have 1 billion people actually this radiate across these groups, and that is going to change. We believe that it's going to change communities and actually target some of those things with the UN that they're really trying to look at fixing, but how do we do that right from 3-4-year-old students in junior kindergarten all the way through to, their grandparents that they're living with. So how do we do that through education? And I actually really do believe that it is the sort of the center point for real change.
If you only had a little more passion for it, this might go somewhere. Talk about a social contagion. My gosh. I
get fired up.
I could absolutely listen to you talk about it. I could engage in this conversation for a whole lot longer than we have available to us right now. But we will pick that conversation up. So I guess the two quick things, because then I know we got to start to wrap up here. But first, is there a way for people to get involved with the Hero Generation now if they wanted to help the effort in some way? Is there something they can do now, or is there something they should be watching for?
Yeah, we have on our website, we have, sign up my school, basically, or volunteer. We're always looking for people. We include all of our community. We have schools from all over the place, but it's always, let's bring people from all over the place, especially educators. We love their input on what we could be doing to improve the curriculum. How could they embrace it at their school, even just in an analog way? Or, I'm always happy to provide templates for people to use it with their students, any of that kind of stuff. They just have to go to the website and go to the Hero Gen tab and then say that they want to be involved. And we're happy to bring people in because we have a really big goal. We need a lot of people involved to make this happen.
So everybody, you'll find this in the show notes, but that URL is plasticitylabs.com, and then click on the Hero Generation tab. Plasticitylabs.com, click on the Hero Gen tab. And then I guess just before we completely wrap up, where do you go or where can people go if they want to start to find some of these practices that they could take on? You've mentioned certainly the kind of the gratitude practice that's there. You've mentioned a couple of key questions. Are there resources you have available, or where is it that you turn to for resources and beginning to travel this journey?
Well, that's a great question. And we went to all of the books. There's so many great books, and I'm happy to share that. But, there's a really great, there's a couple great websites too. Good Think has some great websites or great activities there. I know Sean Akers' book is excellent with activities for you to get engaged in. We have, a lot of the positive psychology sites where Martin Seligman is involved in, like at UPenn. I know they have activities there. I have a few at the end of each chapter in the book too, things for you to engage in as well yourself, and bringing it specifically into the workplace. I really focus on that, trying to make your workplace a lot better. But, one of the things about the actions and the activities is that they're simpler than people think. Yeah. Even if people just start with writing down 3 things that they're grateful for before bed at night and sitting at the dinner table and asking their child what made them smile today, that kicks it off. Yeah. And then it becomes we call it the gateway drug, or Michel Guillain affectionately calls it the gateway drug, is gratitude to the rest of your exploration around happiness. So I would definitely say to listeners to just start with gratitude. Even put a sticky note on someone's desk once a week and say what you're grateful for them at work. That can improve the workplace, and it starts to create a contagion, and you have sticky notes suddenly all over everyone's chairs about what makes you happy about that person. And that's where it starts. You just have to be the catalyst. You have to be the first person to start the contagion.
That's excellent. And that is true. The gratitude just opens you up to so much that you have no realize, and it doesn't take long. It's amazing how quick it catches. So I guess, Jen, if we bring this around full circle, the name of the show is The Meaningful Way. And I love asking our guests, our experts on this show, to share with our listeners, what is it that makes life meaningful for you?
Well, I love that you asked that question, because that is what is key to all of this. Obviously, you can tell by my passion that this work is meaningful for me, obviously, because I feel, after going through what I went through, and I realized if I look back and I'm honest about my life and what I had a lot of stuff back in California, and I had a life that on paper seemed like it should be happy, but it actually wasn't. And reflection and true understanding of what actually makes you happy is what I want other people to start to do. And that brings me meaning. Obviously, I care about young people, and my family is so important to me. Moved 5,000 miles back from the beautiful California weather to be in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, where it's freezing cold, to be with them, because that's meaningful. But I would say that what is most meaningful is just getting people to be at a state of awareness and be present with who they are, and give them the chance to think about what they could do in a small way that could make their lives happier, but that it also could impact the lives of other people. Because that really does, for me, what I've realized, it really does for me, make me feel true joy. And I realized that I didn't have that before, and now I have it, and I want other people to have that same feeling, because it's quite powerful.
The question that just popped into my head for our listeners from everything that you just shared is that if everyone out there, just picture for a moment that you have a reset moment in life. And hopefully you don't have to go through that. Hopefully you don't have that reset experience. But if you were to picture that you had that reset experience, or you were going through that time, how would you redefine the meaningfulness within your life? And then how is it that you can re-engineer your life that way? Jen, I want to thank you for all of the insights, the absolute wonderful energy and passion as well for all of that, all that you do, as well as the wisdom that is there. Thank you so much for coming on The Meaningful Way.
I really appreciate it, Luke. It was such an enjoyable conversation. We could do this for hours. Thank you so much for hosting me. I had a great time.
Thank you. Everyone, I'm going to encourage you to get out there, pick up the book, Unlocking Happiness at Work. You'll find many of those exercises that Jen's been talking about throughout the show. I'm also going to encourage you to come on down to Miami, March 17th and 19th. Check us out at the World Happiness Summit. You can see Jen there. I'll be there. Several of the people that Jen mentioned, Sean Aker, Michelle Geelan. These are just some of the amazing speakers and people that are going to be down there sharing their wisdom, sharing their gift, and sharing a lot of practices for you to take home and make your life happier and make the world happier. So with that in mind, I guess the one thing I will leave you with this week is another question, and that is simply, what is going to make you smile today? Until next time, enjoy the journey. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Our guest is actually a speaker at the upcoming World Happiness Summit on March 17th to 19th, happening in Miami, Florida. This is going to be truly an unbelievable event that has brought together a host of thought leaders and experts from around the world on the topic of happiness, well-being, and how it is that we're going to flourish in our lives, in our world, and in our organizations. You're also going to walk away with many practical tools, exercises, and practices to help you expand happiness within your life, as well as start to get connected to a larger tribe and a bigger movement that is making happiness a reality and even a human right around the world. If you want to learn more, head over to happinesssummit.world. That's happinesssummit.world to learn about the World Happiness Summit happening March 17th to 19th in Miami, Florida. I hope to see you there.